Ira Ringgold's older brother, Murray, was my first high school English teacher, and it was through him that I hooked up with Ira. In 1946, Murray was just back from the Army, where he served with the 17th Airborne Division at the Battle of the Bulge. In March 1945, he made the famous jump across the Rhine that signaled the beginning of the end of the European War. He was, in those days, a crusty, brash, bald-headed guy, not as tall as Ira, but rangy and athletic, who hovered over our heads in a perpetual state of awareness. He was altogether natural in his manner and posture, while in his speech verbally copious and intellectually almost menacing. His passion was to explain, to clarify, to make us understand, with the result that every last subject we talked about he broke down into its principal elements no less meticulously than he diagrammed sentences on the blackboard. His special talent was for dramatizing inquiry, for casting a strong narrative spell even when he was being strictly analytic and scrutinizing aloud in his clear-cut way what we read and wrote. Along with the brawn and the conspicuous braininess, Mr. Ringgold brought with him into the classroom a charge of visceral spontaneity that was a revelation to tamed, respectabilized kids who were yet to comprehend that obeying a teacher's rules of decorum had nothing to do with mental development. There was more importance than perhaps even he imagined in his winning predilection for heaving a blackboard eraser in your direction when the answer you gave didn't hit the mark. Or maybe there wasn't. Maybe Mr. Ringgold knew very well that what boys like me needed to learn was not only how to express themselves with precision and acquire a more discerning response to words, but how to be rambunctious without being stupid, how not to be too well concealed or too well behaved, how to begin to release the masculine intensities from the institutional rectitude that intimidated the bright kids the most. You felt, in the sexual sense, the power of a male high school teacher like Murray Ringgold, masculine authority uncorrected by piety, and you felt, in the priestly sense, the vocation of a male high school teacher like Murray Ringgold, who wasn't lost in the amorphous American aspiration to make it big, who, unlike the school's women teachers, could have chosen to be almost anything else and chose instead for his life's work to be ours. All he wanted all day long was to deal with young people he could influence, and his biggest kick in life he got from their response. Not that the impression his bold classroom style left on my sense of freedom was apparent at the time. No kid thought that way about school or teachers or himself. An incipient craving for social independence, however, had to have been nourished somewhat by Murray's example, and I told him this when, in July 1997, for the first time since I graduated from high school in 1950, I ran into Murray, now 90 years old, but in every discernible way still the teacher whose task is realistically, without self-parody or inflating dramatics, to personify for his students the maverick dictum, "I don't give a good goddamn," to teach them that you don't have to be Al Capone to transgress. You just have to think. In human society, Mr. Ringgold taught us, thinking's the greatest transgression of all. Critical thinking, Mr. Ringgold said, using his knuckles to rap out each of the syllables on his desktop. There is the ultimate subversion. I told Murray that hearing this early on from a manly guy like him, seeing it demonstrated by him, provided the most valuable clue to growing up that I had clutched at, albeit half comprehendingly as a provincial, protected, high-minded high school kid yearning to be rational and of consequence and free. Murray, in turn, told me everything that as a youngster I didn't know and couldn't have known about his brother's private life, a grave misfortune replete with farce over which Murray would sometimes find himself brooding, even though Ira was dead now more than 30 years. Thousands and thousands of Americans destroyed in those years, political casualties, historical casualties because of their beliefs, Murray said. But I don't remember anybody else being brought down quite the way that Ira was. It wasn't on the great American battlefield he would himself have chosen for his destruction. Maybe, despite ideology, politics, and history, a genuine catastrophe is always personal bathos at the core. Life can't be impugned for any failure to trivialize people. You have to take your hat off to life for the techniques at its disposal to strip a man of his significance and empty him totally of his pride. Murray also told me, when I asked, how he had been stripped of his significance. I knew the general story, but little of the details, because I began my own Army stint and wasn't around Newark again for years after I graduated college in 1954, and Murray's political ordeal didn't get underway until May 1955. We started with Murray's story, and it was only at the end of the afternoon when I asked if he'd like to stay for dinner that he seemed to feel in unison with me that our relations had shifted to a more intimate plane and that it wouldn't be incorrect if he went on to speak openly about his brothers. Out near where I live in western New England, a small college called Athena runs a series of week-long summer programs for elderly people, and Murray was enrolled as a student at 90 for the course grandly entitled Shakespeare at the Millennium. That's how I'd run into him in town on the Sunday he arrived. Having failed to recognize him, I was fortunate that he recognized me, and how we came to spend our 6 evenings together. That's how the past turned up this time, in the shape of a very old man whose talent was to give his troubles not 1 second more thought than they warranted, and who still couldn't waste his time talking other than to a serious point. A palpable obstinacy lent his personality its flinty fullness, and this despite time's radical pruning of his old athletic physique. Looking at Murray while he spoke in that familiarly unhidden, scrupulous way of his, I thought, there it is. Human life. There is endurance. In 1955, almost 4 years after Ira was blacklisted from radio for being a communist, Murray had been dismissed from his teaching job by the Board of Education for refusing to cooperate with the House Un-American Activities Committee when it had come through Newark for 4 days of hearings. He was reinstated, but only after a 6-year legal struggle that ended in a 5-4 decision by the state Supreme Court. Reinstated with back pay, minus the amount of money he had earned supporting his family those 6 years as a vacuum salesman. When you don't know what else to do, Murray said with a smile, you sell vacuum cleaners. Door to door. Kirby vacuum cleaners. You spill a full ashtray onto the carpet, and then you vacuum it up for them. You vacuum the house for them. That's how you sell the thing. Vacuumed half the houses in New Jersey in my day. Look, I had a lot of well-wishers, Nathan. I had a wife whose medical expenses were constant, and we had a child, but I was getting a pretty good amount of business, and I sold a lot of people vacuum cleaners. And despite her scoliosis problems, Doris went back to work. She went back to the lab at the hospital, did the blood work, eventually ran the lab. In those days, there was no separation between the technical stuff and the medical arts. Doris did it all. Drew the blood, stained the slides, very patient, very thorough with a microscope, well-trained, observant, accurate, knowledgeable. She used to come home from the Beth Israel, just across the street from us, and cook dinner in her lab coat. Ours was the only family I ever knew of whose salad dressing was served in laboratory flasks, the Erlenmeyer flask. We stirred our coffee with pipettes. All our glassware was from the lab. When we were on our uppers, Doris made ends meet. Together, we were able to tackle it. And they came after you because you were Ira's brother? I asked. That's what I always assumed. I can't say for sure. Ira thought so. Maybe they came after me because I never behaved the way a teacher was supposed to behave. Maybe they would have come after me even without Ira. I started out as a firebrand, Nathan. I burned with zeal to establish the dignity of my profession. That may be what rankled them more than anything else. The personal indignity that you had to undergo as a teacher when I first started teaching, you wouldn't believe it. Being treated like children. Whatever the superiors told you, that was law. Unquestioned. You will get here at this time. You will sign the time book on time. You will spend so many hours in school, and you will be called on for afternoon and evening assignments, even though that wasn't part of your contract. All kinds of chicken shit stuff. You felt denigrated. I threw myself into organizing our union. I moved quickly into committee leadership, executive board positions. I was outspoken, at times, I admit, pretty glib. I thought I knew all the answers, but I was interested in teachers getting respect and proper emoluments for their labors and so forth. Teachers had problems with pay, working conditions, benefits. The superintendent of schools was no friend of mine. I had been prominent in the move to deny him promotion to the superintendency. I supported another man, and he lost. So, because I made no bones about my opposition to this son of a bitch, he hated my guts. And in '55, the axe fell, and I was called downtown to the federal building to a meeting of the House Un-American Activities Committee to testify. Chairman was Representative Walter. 2 more members of the committee came with him. 3 of them up from Washington with their lawyer. They were investigating communist influence in everything in the city of Newark, but primarily investigating what they called the infiltration of the party into labor and education. There had been a sweep of these hearings throughout the country, Detroit, Chicago. We knew it was coming. It was inevitable. They knocked us teachers off in one day, the last day, a Thursday in May. I testified for 5 minutes. Have you now, or have you ever been? I refused to answer. Well, why won't you, they said. You've got nothing to hide. Why don't you come clean? We just want information. That's all we're here for. We write legislation. We're not a punitive body, and so forth. But as I understood the Bill of Rights, my political beliefs were none of their business, and that's what I told them. It's none of your business. Earlier in the week, they'd gone after the United Electrical Workers, Ira's old union back in Chicago. On Monday evening, 1,000 UE members came over on chartered buses from New York to picket the Robert Treat Hotel where the committee staff members were staying. The Star-Ledger described the picketers' appearance as an invasion of forces hostile to the congressional inquiry. Not a legal demonstration as guaranteed by rights laid down in the Constitution, but an invasion, like Hitler's of Poland and Czechoslovakia. One of the committee congressmen pointed out to the press, and without a trace of embarrassment at the un-Americanness lurking in his observation, that a lot of the demonstrators were chanting in Spanish, evidence to him that they didn't know the meaning of the signs they were carrying, and they were ignorant dupes of the Communist Party. He took heart from the fact that they had been kept under surveillance by the subversive squad of the Newark police. After the bus caravan passed through Hudson County on the way back to New York, some big cop there was quoted as saying, "If I knew they were Reds, I'd have locked all 1,000 of them up." That was the local atmosphere. And that was what had been appearing in the press by the time I got to be questioned, the first to be called up on Thursday. Near the end of my 5 minutes, in the face of my refusal to cooperate, the chairman said that he was disappointed that a man of my education and understanding should be unwilling to help the security of this country by telling the committee what it wanted to know. I took that silently. The only hostile remark I made was when one of those bastards closed off by telling me, "Sir, I question your loyalty." I told him, "And I question yours." And the chairman told me that if I continued to slur any member of the committee, he would have me ejected. "We don't have to sit here," he told me, "and take your bunk and listen to your slurs." "Neither do I said, "have to sit here and listen to your slurs, Mr. Chairman." That was as bad as it got. My lawyer whispered to me to cut it out, and that was the end of my appearance. I was excused. But as I got up to leave my chair, one of the congressmen called after me, I suppose to provoke me into contempt. "How can you be paid by the taxpayers' money when you are obligated by your damnable communist oath to teach the Soviet line? How in God's name can you be a free agent and teach what the communists dictate? Why don't you get out of the party and reverse your tracks? I plead with you, return to the American way of life." But I didn't take the bait. Didn't tell him that what I taught had nothing to do with the dictates of anything other than composition and literature. Though, in the end, it didn't seem to matter what I said or didn't say. That evening, in the sports final edition, there was my kisser on the front page of the Newark News over the caption, "Red Probe Witness Bulky," and the line, "Won't take your bunk, HUAC tells Newark teacher." Now, one of the committee members was a congressman from New York State, Bryden Grant. You remember the Grants? Bryden and Katrina. Americans everywhere remember the Grants. Well, the Ringolds were the Rosenbergs to the Grants. This society pretty boy, this vicious nothing, all but destroyed our family. And did you ever know why? Because one night, Grant and his wife were at a party that Ira and Eve were giving on West 11th Street, and Ira went after Grant the way only Ira could go after somebody. Grant was a pal of Werner von Braun's, or Ira thought so, and Ira laid into him but good. Grant was, to the naked eye that is, an effete, upper-class guy of the sort who set Ira's teeth on edge. The wife wrote those popular romances that the ladies devoured, and Grant was then still a columnist for the Journal American. To Ira, Grant was the incarnation of pampered privilege. He couldn't stand him. Grant's every gesture made him sick, and his politics he abhorred. Well, there was a big, loud scene, Ira shouting and calling Grant names, and for the rest of his life, Ira maintained that a Grant vendetta against us began that night. Ira had a way of presenting himself without camouflage. Comes just as he is, holding nothing back without a single plea. That was his magnetism for you, but it's also what made him repellent to his enemies. And Grant was one of his enemies. The whole squabble took 3 minutes. But according to Ira, 3 minutes that sealed his fate and mine. He humiliated a descendant of Ulysses S. Grant and a graduate of Harvard and an employee of William Randolph Hearst's, not to mention the husband of the author of Eloise and Abelard, the biggest bestseller of 1938, and The Passion of Galileo, the biggest bestseller of 1942, and that was it for us. We were finished. By publicly insulting Bride Grant, Ira had challenged not only the husband's impeccable credentials, but the wife's inextinguishable need to be right. Now, I'm not sure that explains everything, though not because Grant was any less reckless in the use of power than the rest of Nixon's gang. Before he went to Congress, he wrote that column for the Journal American, a gossip column 3 times a week about Broadway and Hollywood with a dollop of Eleanor Roosevelt defiling thrown in. That's how Grant's public service began. That's what qualified him so highly for a seat on the Un-American Activities Committee. He was a gossip columnist before it became the big business it is today. He was in there at the start in the heyday of the great pioneers. There was Charlie Knickerbocker and Winchell and Ed Sullivan and Earl Wilson. There was Damon Runyon. There was Bob Considine. There was Hedda Hopper. And Bride Grant was the snob of the mob. Not the street fighter, not the lowlife, not the fast-talking insider who hung out at Sardi's or the Brown Derby or Stillman's Gym, but the blue blood to the rabble who hung out at the Racket Club. Grant began with a column called Grant's Grapevine. And if you remember, he nearly ended as Nixon's White House chief of staff. Oh, Congressman Grant was a great favorite of Nixon's. Sat, as Nixon did, on the Un-American Activities Committee. Did a lot of President Nixon's arm twisting in the House. I remember when the new Nixon administration floated Grant's name back in '68 for chief of staff. Too bad they let it drop. The worst decision Nixon ever made. If only Nixon had found the political advantage in appointing, instead of Haldeman, this Brahmin hack to head the Watergate cover-up operation, Grant's career might have ended up behind bars. Bride Grant in jail, in a cell between Mitchell's and Ehrlichman's. Grant's tomb. But it was never to be. You can hear Nixon singing Grant's praises on the White House tapes. It's there in the transcripts. Bryden's heart is in the right place, the president tells Haldeman, and he's tough. He'll do anything, I mean anything. He tells Haldeman Grant's motto for how to handle the administration's enemies: destroy them in the press. And then, admiringly, an Epicurean of the perfect smear, of the vilification that burns with a hard, gem-like flame, the president adds, Bryden's got the killer instinct. No, but he does a more beautiful job. Congressman Grant died in his sleep, a rich and powerful old statesman, still greatly esteemed in Stottsburg, New York, where they named the high school football field after him. During the hearing, I watched Bride Grant trying to believe that there was more to him than a politician with a personal vendetta, finding in the national obsession the means to settle a score. In the name of reason, you search for some higher motive. You look for some deeper meaning. It was still my want in those days to try to be reasonable about the unreasonable and to look for complexity in simple things. I would make demands upon my intelligence where none were really necessary. I would think he cannot be as petty and vapid as he seems. That can't be more than 1/10 of the story. There must be more to him than that. But why? Pettiness and vapidity can come on the grand scale, too. What could be more unwavering than pettiness and vapidity? Do pettiness and vapidity get in the way of being cunning and tough? Do pettiness and vapidity vitiate the aim of being an important personage? You don't need a developed view of life to be fond of power. You don't need a developed view of life to rise to power. A developed view of life may, in fact, be the worst impediment, while not having a developed view the most splendid advantage. You didn't have to summon up misfortunes from his patrician childhood to make sense of Congressman Grant. This is the guy, after all, who took over the congressional seat of Hamilton Fish, the original Roosevelt hater. A Hudson River aristocrat like FDR, Fish went to Harvard just after FDR. Envied him, hated him, and because Fish's district included Hyde Park, wound up FDR's congressman. A terrific isolationist and stupid as they come, Fish, back in the 30s, was the first upper-crust ignoramus to serve as chairman of the precursor of that pernicious committee. The prototypical self-righteous flag-waving, narrow-minded patrician son of a bitch, that was Hamilton Fish. And when they redistricted the Old Fools District in '52, Brydon Grant was his boy. After the hearing, Grant left the dais where the 3 committee members and their lawyers were seated and made a beeline for my chair. He was the one who said to me, "I question your loyalty." But now he smiled graciously, as only Brydon Grant could, as though he had invented the gracious smile. And he put out his hand, and so loathsome as it was to me, I shook it. The hand of unreason, and reasonably, civilly, the way fighters touch gloves before a fight, I shook it. And my daughter Lorraine was appalled with me for days afterwards. Grant said, "Mr. Ringgold, I traveled up here today to help you clear your name. I wish you could have been more cooperative. You don't make it easy, even for those of us who are sympathetic. I want you to know that I wasn't scheduled to represent the committee in Newark. But I knew you were to be a witness, and so I asked to come because I didn't think it would be much help to you if my friend and colleague Donald Jackson were to show up instead." Jackson was the guy who had taken Nixon's seat on the committee, Donald L. Jackson of California. A dazzling thinker, given to public statements like, "It seems to me that the time has come to be an American or not an American." It was Jackson and Veld who led the manhunt to root out communist subversives into Protestant clergy. That was a pressing national issue for these guys. After Nixon's departure from the committee, Grant was considered the committee's intellectual spearhead, who drew their profound conclusions for them, and, sad to say, more than likely, he was. He said to me, "I thought that perhaps I could help you more than the honorable gentleman from California. Despite your performance here today, I still think I can. I want you to know that if after a good night's sleep you decide you want to clear your name," that was when Lorraine erupted. She was all of 14. She and Doris had been sitting behind me, and throughout the session, Lorraine had been fuming even more audibly than her mother, fuming and squirming, barely able to contain the agitation in her 14-year-old frame. "Clear his name of what?" Lorraine said to Congressman Grant. "What did my father do?" Grant smiled at her benignly. He was very good-looking with all that silver hair, and he was fit, and his suits were the most expensive Triplers made, and his manners couldn't have affronted anyone's mother. He had that nicely blended voice, respectful, at once soft and manly, and he said to Lorraine, "You're a loyal daughter." But Lorraine wouldn't quit, and neither Doris nor I tried to stop her right off. "Clear his name? He doesn't have to clear his name. It's not dirty," she told Grant. "You're the one who's dirtying his name." "Miss Ringgold, you're off the issue. Your father has a history," Grant said. "History?" Lorraine said. "What history? What's his history?" Again he smiled. "Miss Ringgold," he said, "you're a very nice young lady." "Whether I'm nice has nothing to do with what is his history. What did he do? What is it that he has to clear? Tell me what my father did." "Your father will have to tell us what he did." "My father has already spoken," she said, "and you're twisting everything he says into a pack of lies just to make him look bad. His name is clean. He can go to bed at night. I don't know how you can, sir. My father served his country as well as the rest of them. He knows about loyalty and fighting and what's American, and this is how you treat people who serve their country? Is that what he fought for? So you could sit here and try to blacken his name? Try to sling mud all over him? That's what America is? That's what you call loyalty? What have you done for America? Gossip columns? That's so American? My father has principles, and they're decent American principles, and you have no business trying to destroy him. He goes to school, he teaches children, he works as hard as he can. You should have 1 million teachers like him. Is that the problem? He's too good? Is that why you have to tell lies about him? Leave my father alone. When Grant still wouldn't reply, Lorraine cried, "What's the matter? You had so much to say when you were up there, understand? And now you're Mr. Dumbmouth? Your little lips sealed shut?" Right there, I put my hand on hers and I said, "That's enough." And then she got angry with me. "No, it's not enough. It's not going to be enough until they stop treating like this. Aren't you going to say anything? Mr. Grant, is this what America is? Nobody says anything in front of 14-year-olds? Just because I don't vote, is that the problem? Well, I certainly will never vote for you or any of your lousy friends." And she burst into tears. And that was when Grant said to me, "You know where to reach me." And he smiled at the three of us and left for Washington. That's the way it goes. They fuck you, and then they tell you, you are lucky you got fucked by me and not by the honorable gentleman from California. I never did get in touch with him. The fact was that my political beliefs were pretty localized. They were never inflated like Ira's. I was never interested like he was in the fate of the world. I was more interested from a professional point of view in the fate of the community. My concern was not even so much political as economic. And I would say sociological, in terms of working conditions, in terms of the status of teachers in the city of Newark. The next day, the mayor, Mayor Carlin, told the press that people like me should not be teaching our children. And the Board of Education put me on trial for conduct on becoming a teacher. The superintendent saw this was his warrant for getting rid of me. I didn't answer the questions of a responsible government agency, so ipso facto, I was unfit. I told the Board of Education that my political beliefs were not relevant to my being an English teacher in the Newark school system. There were only 3 grounds for dismissal: insubordination, incompetence, and moral turpitude. I argued that none of these applied. Former students came down to the board hearing to testify that I had never tried to indoctrinate anybody in class or anywhere else. Nobody in the school system had ever heard me attempt to indoctrinate anyone into anything other than respect for the English language. None of the parents, none of the students, none of my colleagues. My former Army captain, he testified for me. Came up from Fort Bragg. That was impressive. I enjoyed selling vacuum cleaners. There were people who crossed the street when they saw me coming, even people who may have felt ashamed doing it, but who didn't want to be contaminated. But that didn't bother me. I had a lot of support within the teachers' union, a lot of support outside. Contributions came in. We had Doris's salary. And I sold my vacuum cleaners. I met people in all lines of work, and I made contact with the real world beyond teaching. You know, I was a professional, a school teacher, reading books, teaching Shakespeare, making you kids diagram sentences and memorize poetry and appreciate literature, and I thought no other kind of life was worth living. But I went out selling vacuum cleaners, and I acquired a great deal of admiration for a lot of people I met, and I'm still grateful for it. I think I have a better outlook on life because of it. Suppose you hadn't been reinstated by the court. Would you still have a better outlook? If I had lost, I think I would have made a fair living. I think I would have survived intact. I might have had some regrets, but I don't think I would have been affected temperamentally. In an open society as bad as it can get, there's an escape. To lose your job and have the newspapers calling you a traitor, these are very unpleasant things. But it's still not the situation that is total, which is totalitarianism. I wasn't put in jail, and I wasn't tortured. My child wasn't denied anything. My livelihood was taken away from me, and some people stopped talking to me, but other people admired me. My wife admired me. My daughter admired me. Many of my ex-students admired me, openly said so. And I could put up a legal fight. I had free movement. I could give interviews, raise money, hire a lawyer, make courtroom challenges, which I did. Of course, you can become so depressed and miserable that you give yourself a heart attack, but you can find alternatives, which I also did. Now, if the union had failed, that would have affected me. But we didn't. We fought, and eventually we won. We equalized the pay of men and women. We equalized the pay of secondary and elementary school teachers. We made sure that all after-school activities were first voluntary and then paid for. We fought to get more sick leave. We argued for 5 days off for any purpose whatsoever that the individual chose. We achieved promotion by examination as opposed to favoritism, which meant that all minorities had a fair chance. We attracted blacks to the union, and as they increased in numbers, they moved into leadership positions, but that was years ago. Now, the union's a big disappointment to me. Just become a money-grubbing organization. Pay, that's all. What to do to educate the kids is the last thing on anybody's mind. Big disappointment. How awful was it for those 6 years, I asked him. What did it take out of you? I don't think it took anything out of me. I really don't think so. You do a hell of a lot of not sleeping at night, of course. Many nights I had a hard time sleeping. You're thinking of all kinds of things. How do you do this, and what are you going to do next? Whom do you call on, and so forth. I was always redoing what had happened and projecting what would happen. But then the morning comes, and you get up, and you do what you have to do. And how did Ira take this happening to you? It distressed him. I'd go as far as to say it ruined him had he not already been ruined by everything else. I was confident all along that I was going to win, and I told this to him. They had no legal reasons for firing me. He kept saying, "You're kidding yourself. They don't need legal reasons." He knew of too many guys who had been fired, period. Eventually, I won. But he felt responsible for what I went through. He carried it around with him for the rest of his life. About you, too, you know. About what happened to you. Me? I said. Nothing happened to me. I was a kid. Something happened to you. Of course, it should not be too surprising to find out that your life story has included an event, something important that you have known nothing about. Your life story is in and of itself something that you know very little about. If you remember, Murray said, when you graduated from college, you didn't get a Fulbright. That was because of my brother. In 1953-54, my last year at Chicago, I'd applied for a Fulbright to do graduate work in literature at Oxford and been turned down. I'd been near the top of my class in enthusiastic recommendations, and, as I now remembered it for the first time probably since it happened, was shocked not only at being turned down, but because a Fulbright to study literature in England went to a fellow student who was well below me in class standing. This true, Murray? I just thought it was screwy, unfair, the fickleness of fate. I didn't know what to think. I was robbed, I thought, and then I got drafted. How do you know this is so? The agent told Ira, the FBI. He was on Ira for years, stopping around to visit him, coming around to try to get him to name names, told him that's how he could clear himself. They had you down for Ira's nephew. His nephew? How come his nephew? Don't ask me. The FBI didn't always get everything right. Maybe they didn't always want to get everything right. The guy told Ira, "You know your nephew who applied for a Fulbright? The kid in Chicago? He didn't get it because of you being a communist." You think that was true? No doubt about it. All the while I was listening to Murray and looking at the needle of a man he'd become and thinking of this physique as the materialization of all that coherence of his, as the consequence of a lifelong indifference to everything other than liberty in its most austere sense, thinking that Murray was an essentialist, that his character wasn't contingent, that wherever he found himself, even selling vacuum cleaners, he'd managed to find his dignity. Thinking that Murray, whom I didn't love or have to, with whom there was just the contract, teacher and student, was Ira, whom I did love. In a more mental, sensible, matter-of-fact version, Ira with a practical, clear, well-defined social goal. Ira without the heroically exaggerated ambitions, without that passionate, overheated relationship to everything. Ira, unblurred by impulse and the argument with everything. I had a picture in my mind of Murray's unclothed upper torso, still blessed, when he was already 41, with all the signs of youth and strength. The picture I had was of Murray Ringgold as I had seen him late one Tuesday afternoon, the fall of 1948, leaning out the window and removing the screens from the second-floor apartment where he lived with his wife and daughter on Lehigh Avenue. Taking down the screens, putting up the screens, clearing the snow, salting the ice, sweeping the sidewalk, clipping the hedge, washing the car, collecting and burning the leaves twice daily from October through March, descending to the cellar and tending the furnace that heated your flat, stoking the fire, banking the fire, shoveling the ashes, lugging ashes up the stairs in buckets and out to the garbage. A tenant, a renter, had to be fit to get all his chores done before and after going to work. Vigilant and diligent and fit. just as the wives had to be fit to lean from their open back windows while rooted to the floor of the apartment, and, whatever the temperature, up there like seamen at work in the rigging, to hang the wet clothes out on the clothesline, to peg them with the clothespins an item at a time, feeding the line out until all the waterlogged family wash was hung and the line was full and flapping in the air of industrial Newark. And then to haul the line in again to remove the laundry item by item, remove it all and fold it into the laundry basket to carry into the kitchen when the clothes were dry and ready to be ironed. To keep a family going, there was primarily money to be made and food to be prepared and discipline to be imposed. But there were also these heavy, awkward sailor-like activities, the climbing, the hoisting, the hauling, the dragging, the cranking in, the reeling out, all the stuff that would tick by me as, on my bicycle, I traversed the 2 miles from my house to the library. Tick, tock, tick. The metronome of daily neighborhood life, the old American city chain of being. Across the street from Mr. Ringgold's Lehigh Avenue house was the Beth Israel Hospital, where I knew Mrs. Ringgold had worked as a lab assistant before their daughter was born, and around the corner was the Osborne Terrace Branch Library, where I used to bicycle for a weekly supply of books. The hospital, the library, and, as represented by my teacher, the school. The neighborhood's institutional nexus was all reassuringly present for me in virtually that 1 square block. Yes, the everyday workability of neighborhood life was in full swing on that afternoon in 1948 when I saw Mr. Ringgold hanging out over the sill undoing a screen from the front window. As I braked to descend the steep Lehigh Avenue hill, I watched him thread a rope through one of the screen's corner hooks and then, after calling down, "Here she comes," lower it along the face of the 2.5-story building to a man in the garden who undid the rope and set the screen onto a pile stacked against the brick stoop. I was struck by the way Mr. Ringgold performed an act that was both athletic and practical. To perform that act as gracefully as he did, you had to be very strong. When I got to the house, I saw that the man in the garden was a giant wearing glasses. It was Ira. It was the brother who had come to our high school, to auditorium, to portray Abe Lincoln. He appeared on the stage in costume and, standing all alone, delivered Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and then the second inaugural, concluding with what Mr. Ringgold, the orator's brother, later told us, was as noble and beautiful a sentence as any American president, as any American writer, had ever written. A long, chugging locomotive of a sentence, its tail end a string of weighty cabooses that he then made us diagram and analyze and discuss for an entire class period. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on, to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. For the rest of the program, Abraham Lincoln removed his stovepipe hat and debated the pro-slavery Senator Stephen A. Douglas, whose lines, the most insidiously anti-Negro of which a group of students, we members of an extracurricular discussion group called the Contemporary Club, loudly booed, were read by Murray Ringgold, who had arranged for Iron Rinn to visit the school. As if it weren't disorienting enough to see Mr. Ringgold out in public without a shirt and tie, without even an undershirt, Iron Rinn wasn't wearing any more than a prize fighter. Shorts, sneakers, that was it. All but naked, not only the biggest man I'd ever seen up close, but the most famous. Iron Rinn was heard on network radio every Thursday night on The Free and the Brave, a popular weekly dramatization of inspiring episodes out of American history, impersonating people like Nathan Hale and Orville Wright and Wild Bill Hickok and Jack London. In real life, he was married to Eve Frame, the leading lady of the weekly repertory playhouse for serious drama called the American Radio Theater. My mother knew everything about Iron Rinn and Eve Frame through the magazines she read at the beauty parlor. She would never have bought any of these magazines. She disapproved of them, as did my father, who wished his family to be exemplary. but she read them under the dryer, and then she saw all the fashion magazines when she went off on Saturday afternoons to help her friend, Mrs. Fursky, who, with her husband, had a dress shop on Bergen Street right next door to Mrs. Unterberg's millinery shop, where my mother also occasionally helped out on Saturdays and during the pre-Easter rush. One night, after we had listened to the American Radio Theater, which we'd done since I could remember, my mother told us about Eve Frame's wedding to Iron Rin and all the stage and radio personalities who were guests. Eve Frame had worn a two-piece wool suit of dusty pink, sleeves trimmed with double rings of matching fox fur, and on her head the sort of hat that no one in the world wore more charmingly than she did. My mother called it a veiled come-hither hat, a style that Eve Frame had apparently made famous opposite the silent film matinee idol Carlton Pennington in My Darling, Come Hither, where she played to perfection a spoiled young socialite. It was a veiled come-hither hat that she was well known for wearing when she stood before the microphone, script in hand, performing on the American Radio Theater, though she had also been photographed before a radio microphone in slouch-brimmed felts, in pillboxes, in Panama straw hats, and once, when she was a guest on the Bob Hope Show, my mother remembered in a black straw saucer seductively veiled with gossamer silk thread. My mother told us that Eve Frame was 6 years older than Iron Rin, that her hair grew an inch a month and she lightened its color for the Broadway stage, that her daughter Sylphid was a harpist, a Juilliard graduate, and the offspring of Eve Frame's marriage to Carlton Pennington. "Who cares?" my father said. "Nathan does," my mother replied defensively. "Iron Rin is Mr. Ringgold's brother. Mr. Ringgold is his idol." My parents had seen Eve Frame in silent movies when she was a beautiful girl, and she was still beautiful. I knew because 4 years earlier, for my 11th birthday, I had been taken to see my first Broadway play, The Late George Apley by John P. Marquand, and Eve Frame was in it, and afterward my father, whose memories of Eve Frame as a young, silent film actress were still apparently amorously tinged, had said, "That woman speaks the King's English like nobody's business." And my mother, who may or may not have grasped what was fueling his praise, had said, "Yes, but she's let herself go. She speaks beautifully, and she did the part beautifully, and she looked adorable in that short page boy, but the extra pounds are not becoming on a little thing like Eve Frame. Certainly not in a fitted white piqué summer dress, full skirt or no full skirt." A discussion as to whether or not Eve Frame was Jewish invariably occurred among the women in my mother's mahjong club when it was my mother's turn to have them for their weekly game, and particularly after the evening a few months later when I had been a guest of Ira's at Eve Frame's dinner table. The star-struck world round the star-struck boy couldn't stop talking about the fact that people said her real name was Fromkin, Chava Fromkin. There were Fromkins in Brooklyn who were supposed to be the family she had disowned when she went to Hollywood and changed her name. "Who cares?" my serious-minded father would say whenever the subject came up, and he happened to be passing through the living room where the mahjong game was in progress. "They all change their names in Hollywood. That woman opens her mouth, and it's an elocution lesson. She gets up on the stage and portrays a lady. You know it's a lady. They say she's from Flatbush," Mrs. Unterberg, who owned the millinery shop, would routinely put in. "They say that her father is a kosher butcher." "They say Cary Grant is Jewish," my father reminded the ladies. "The fascists used to say that Roosevelt was Jewish. People say everything. That's not what I'm concerned with. I'm concerned with her acting, which in my book is superlative." "Well," said Mrs. Fursky, who with her husband owned the dress shop, "Ruth Tunick's brother-in-law is married to a Fromkin, a Newark Fromkin, and she has relatives in Brooklyn, and they swear their cousin is Eve Frame." "What does Nathan say?" asked Mrs. Kaufman, a housewife and a girlhood friend of my mother's. "He doesn't," my mother replied. I had trained her to say that I didn't. How? Easy. When she had asked, on behalf of the ladies, if I knew whether Eve Frame of the American Radio Theater was, in actuality, Chava Fromkin of Brooklyn, I had told her, "Religion is the opiate of the people. Those things don't matter. I don't care. I don't know, and I don't care." "What is it like there? What did she wear?" Mrs. Unterberg asked my mother. "What did she serve?" Mrs. Kaufman asked. "How was her hair done?" Mrs. Unterberg asked. "Is he really 6'6"? What does Nathan say? Does he wear a size 16 shoe? Some people say that's just publicity." And his skin is as pockmarked as it looks in the pictures? What does Nathan say about the daughter? What kind of name is Sylphid? Asked Mrs. Schlessel, whose husband was a chiropodist like my father. That's a real name? Asked Mrs. Fresky. It's not Jewish, said Mrs. Kaufman. Sylvia is Jewish. I think it's French. But the father wasn't French, said Mrs. Schlessel. The father was Carlton Pennington. She acted with him in all those films. She eloped with him in that movie where he was the older baron. Is that the one where she wore the hat? Nobody in the world, said Mrs. Unterberg, looks like that woman in a hat. Put Ephraim in a snug little beret, in a small floral dinner hat, in a crocheted straw baby doll, in a veiled big black cartwheel. Put her in anything. Put her in a Tyrolean brown felt with a feather. Put her in a white jersey turban. Put her in a fur-lined parka hood. And the woman is gorgeous, regardless. In one picture, she wore, I'll never forget it, said Mrs. Fresky, a gold-embroidered white evening suit with a white ermine muff. I never saw such elegance in my life. There was a play. What was it? We went to see it together, girls. She wore a burgundy wool dress, full at the bodice and the skirt, and the most enchanting scrollwork embroidery. Yes, and that matching veiled hat, tall, burgundy felt, said Mrs. Unterberg, with a crushed veil. Remember her in ruffles and whatever that other play was, said Mrs. Fresky. No one wears ruffles the way she does. White double ruffles on a black cocktail dress. But the name Sylphid, asked Mrs. Schlessel yet again. Sylphid comes from what? Nathan knows. Ask Nathan, Mrs. Fresky said. Is Nathan here? He's doing his homework, my mother said. Ask him, what kind of name is Sylphid? I'll ask him later, said my mother. But she knew enough not to. Even though secretly, ever since I had entered the enchanted circle, I was bursting to talk about all of it to everyone. What do they wear? What do they eat? What do they say while they eat? What is it like there? It is spectacular. The Tuesday that I first met Ira, out in front of Mr. Ringgold's house, was Tuesday, October 12th, 1948. Had the World Series not just ended on Monday, I might, timorously, out of deference to my teacher's privacy, have speeded on by the house where he was taking down the screens with his brother and, without even waving or shouting hello, turned left at the corner onto Osborne Terrace. As it happened, however, the day before I had listened to the Indians beat the old Boston Braves in the final game of the series from the floor of Mr. Ringgold's office. He had brought a radio with him that morning, and after school, those whose families didn't yet own a television set, the vast majority of us, were invited to spill directly out of his 8th period English class and down the hall to crowd into the English department chairman's little office to hear the game, which was already underway at Braves Field. Courtesy, then, necessitated that I slow way, way down and call out to him, Mr. Ringgold, thanks for yesterday. Courtesy necessitated that I nod and smile at the giant in his yard, and with a dry mouth, stiffly stop and introduce myself, and respond a little daffily when he startled me by saying, How you doing, buddy? By replying that on the afternoon he appeared at the auditorium, I'd been one of the boys who had booed Stephen A. Douglas when he announced into Lincoln's face, I am opposed to Negro citizenship in any and every form. Boo! I believe this government was made on a white basis. Boo! I believe it was made for white men. Boo! For the benefit of white men. Boo! And their posterity forever. Boo! I am in favor of confining citizenship to white men instead of conferring it upon Negroes, Indians, and other inferior races. Boo! 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 Something rooted deeper than mere courtesy. Ambition. The ambition to be admired for my moral conviction prompted me to break through the shyness and tell the trinity of Iras, all three of him, the patriot martyr of the podium, Abraham Lincoln, the natural hardy American of the airwaves, Iron Wren, and the redeemed roughneck from Newark's First Ward, Ira Ringgold, that it was I who had instigated the booing. Mr. Ringgold came down the stairs from the second-floor flat, sweating heavily, wearing just khaki trousers and a pair of moccasins. Right behind him came Mrs. Ringgold, who, before retreating back upstairs, set out a tray with a pitcher of ice water and 3 glasses. And so it was, 4:30 p.m., October 12, 1948, a blazing hot autumn day and the most astonishing afternoon of my young life, that I tipped my bike onto its side and sat on the steps of my English teacher's stoop with Ephraim's husband, Iron Rin of the Free and the Brave, discussing a World Series in which Bob Feller had lost 2 games, unbelievable, and Larry Doby, the pioneering black player in the American League, whom we all admired, but not the way we admired Jackie Robinson, had gone 7 for 22. Then we were talking about boxing. Lewis knocking out Jersey Joe Walcott when Walcott was way ahead on points. Tony Zale regaining the middleweight title from Rocky Graziano right in Newark. At Rupert Stadium in June, crushing him with a left in the 3rd round and then losing it to a Frenchman, Marcel Cerdan, over in Jersey City a couple of weeks back in September. And then, from talking to me about Tony Zale one minute, Iron Rin was talking to me about Winston Churchill the next, about a speech that Churchill had made a few days earlier that had him boiling, a speech advising the United States not to destroy its atomic bomb reserve because the atomic bomb was all that prevented the communists from dominating the world. He talked about Winston Churchill the way he talked about Leo DeRocher and Marcel Cerdan. He called Churchill a reactionary bastard and a warmonger with no more hesitation than he called DeRocher a loudmouth and Cerdan a bum. He talked about Churchill as though Churchill ran the gas station out on Lyons Avenue. It wasn't how we talked about Winston Churchill in my house. It was closer to how we talked about Hitler. In his conversation, as in his brother's, there was no invisible line of propriety observed, and there were no conventional taboos. You could stir together anything and everything: sports, politics, history, literature, reckless opinionating, polemical quotation, idealistic sentiment, moral rectitude. There was something marvelously bracing about it, a different and dangerous world, demanding, straightforward, aggressive, freed from the need to please, and freed from school. Iron Rin wasn't just a radio star. He was somebody outside the classroom who was not afraid to say anything. I just finished reading about somebody else who wasn't afraid to say anything, Thomas Paine, and the book I'd read, a historical novel by Howard Fast called Citizen Tom Paine, was one of the collection in my bicycle basket that I was returning to the library. While Ira was denouncing Churchill to me, Mr. Ringgold had stepped over to where the books had tumbled from the basket onto the pavement at the foot of the stoop and was looking at their spines to see what I was reading. Half the books were about baseball and were by John R. Tunis, and the other half were about American history and were by Howard Fast. My idealism, and my idea of a man, was being constructed along parallel lines, one fed by novels about baseball champions who won their games the hard way, suffering adversity and humiliation and many defeats as they struggled toward victory, and the other by novels about heroic Americans who fought against tyranny and injustice, champions of liberty for America and for all mankind, heroic suffering. That was my specialty. Citizen Tom Paine was not so much a novel plotted in the familiar manner as a sustained linking of highly charged rhetorical flourishes, tracing the contradictions of an unsavory man with a smoldering intellect and the purest social ideals, a writer and a revolutionary. He was the most hated, and perhaps by a few the most loved, man in all the world. A mind that burned itself as few minds in all human history. To feel on his own soul the whip laid on the back of millions. His thoughts and ideas were closer to those of the average working man than Jefferson's could ever be. That was Paine, as Fast portrayed him, savagely single-minded and unsociable, an epic, folkloric belligerent, unkempt, dirty, wearing a beggar's clothes, bearing a musket in the unruly streets of wartime Philadelphia. A bitter, caustic man, often drunk, frequenting brothels, hunted by assassins, and friendless. He did it all alone. My only friend is the revolution. By the time I had finished the book, there seemed to me no way other than Paine's for a man to live and die if he was intent on demanding, in behalf of human freedom, demanding both from remote rulers and from the coarse mob, the transformation of society. He did it all alone. There was nothing about Paine that could have been more appealing, however unsentimentally Fast depicted an isolation born of defiant independence and personal misery. For Paine had ended his days alone as well. Old, sick, wretched, and alone, ostracized, betrayed, despised beyond everything for having written in his last testament, The Age of Reason, "I do not believe in the creed professed by the Jewish Church, by the Roman Church, by the Greek church, by the Turkish church, by the Protestant church, nor by any church that I know of. My own mind is my own church. Reading about him had made me feel bold and angry and, above all, free to fight for what I believed in. Citizen Tom Paine was the very book that Mr. Ringgold had picked out of my bicycle basket to bring back to where we were sitting. "You know this one?" he asked his brother. Ayn Rand took my library book in Abe Lincoln's enormous hands and began flipping through the opening pages. "Nope, never read fast," he said. "I should. Wonderful man, guts." He was with Wallace from day one. I catch his column whenever I see the worker, but I don't have the time for novels anymore. In Iran, I did. In the service, read Steinbeck, Upton Sinclair, Jack London, Caldwell. "If you're going to read him, this is fast at his best," Mr. Ringgold said. "Am I right, Nathan?" "The book is great," I answered. "You ever read Common Sense?" Ayn Rand asked me. "Ever read Paine's writings?" No, I said. "Read 'em," Ayn Rand told me while still leafing through my book. "There's a lot of Paine's writings quoted by Howard Fast," I said. Looking up, Ayn Rand said, "The strength of the many is revolution, but curiously enough, mankind has gone through several thousand years of slavery without realizing that fact." "That's in the book," I said. "I should hope so." "You know what the genius of Paine was?" Mr. Ringgold asked me. "It was the genius of all those men, Jefferson, Madison. Know what it was?" "No," I said. "You do know what it was," he said. "To defy the English?" A lot of people did that. No, it was to articulate the cause in English. The revolution was totally improvised, totally disorganized. Isn't that the sense you get from this book, Nathan? Well, these guys had to find a language for the revolution, to find the words for a great purpose. Paine said, I told Mr. Ringgold, "I wrote a little book because I wanted men to see what they were shooting at." And that he did, Mr. Ringgold said. "Here," said Ayn Rand, pointing to some lines in the book. "On George III, listen. I should suffer the misery of devils were I to make a whore of my soul by swearing allegiance to one whose character is that of a sottish, stupid, stubborn, worthless, brutish man." Both quotations from Paine that Ayn Rand had recited, employing his "the free and the brave, people bound" in the rough voice, were among the dozen or so that I myself had written down and memorized. "You like that line?" Mr. Ringgold said to me. "Yes, I like 'a whore of my soul.'" "Why?" he asked me. I was beginning to perspire profusely from the sun on my face, from the excitement of meeting Ayn Rand, and now from being on the spot, having to answer Mr. Ringgold as though I were in class while I was sitting between two shirtless brothers, well over 6 feet tall, two big natural men exuding the sort of forceful, intelligent manliness to which I aspired. Men who could talk about baseball and boxing, talking about books, and talking about books as though something were at stake in a book. Not opening up a book to worship it, or to be elevated by it, or to lose yourself to the world around you. No, boxing with the book. "Because," I said, "you don't ordinarily think of your soul as a whore." "What's he mean, a whore of my soul?" "Selling it," I replied, "selling his soul." "Right. Do you see how much stronger it is to write, 'I should suffer the misery of devils were I to make a whore of my soul,' rather than 'were I to sell my soul'?" "Yes, I do." "Why is that stronger?" "Because in whore, he personifies it." "Yeah, what else?" "Well, the word whore, it's not a conventional word. You don't hear it in public. People don't go around writing whore or in public saying whore. Why don't they? Shame, embarrassment, propriety." "Propriety, good, right. So this is audacious then?" "Yes, and that's what you like about Paine, isn't it? His audacity." "I think so, yes." "And now you know why you like what you like. You're way ahead of the game, Nathan. And you know it because you looked at one word he used, just one word, and you thought about that word he used, and you asked yourself some questions about that word he used until you saw right through that word, saw through it as through a magnifying glass, to one of the sources of this great writer's power. He is audacious. Thomas Paine is audacious. But is that enough? That is only a part of the formula. Audacity must have a purpose. Otherwise, it's cheap and facile and vulgar. Why is Thomas Paine audacious? In behalf, I said, of his convictions? Hey, that's my boy, Iron Wind suddenly announced. That's my boy who booed Mr. Douglas. So it was that I wound up 5 nights later as Iron Wind's backstage guest at a rally held in downtown Newark at the Mosque, the city's biggest theater, for Henry Wallace, the presidential candidate of the newly formed Progressive Party. Wallace had been in Roosevelt's cabinet as Secretary of Agriculture for 7 years before becoming his vice president during Roosevelt's 3rd term. In 1944, he'd been dropped from the ticket and replaced by Truman, in whose cabinet he served briefly as Secretary of Commerce. In 1946, the president fired Wallace for sounding off in favor of cooperation with Stalin and friendship with the Soviet Union at just the point when the Soviet Union had begun to be perceived by Truman and the Democrats not only as an ideological enemy, but as a serious threat to peace whose expansion into Europe and elsewhere had to be contained by the West. This division within the Democratic Party, between the anti-Soviet majority led by the president and the progressive Soviet sympathizers led by Wallace and opposed to the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, was reflected in the split within my own household between father and son. My father, who had admired Wallace when he was FDR's protege, was against the Wallace candidacy for the reason Americans traditionally choose not to support third-party candidates. In this case, because it would draw the votes of the left wing of the Democratic Party away from Truman and make all but certain the election of Governor Thomas E. Dewey of New York, the Republican candidate. The Wallace people were talking about their party polling some 6 or 7 million votes, a percentage of the popular vote vastly greater than had ever gone to any American third party. Your man is only going to deny the Democrats the White House, my father told me, and if we get the Republicans, that will mean the suffering in this country that it has always meant. You weren't around for Hoover and Harding and Coolidge. You don't know firsthand about the heartlessness of the Republican Party. You despise big business, Nathan? You despise what you and Henry Wallace call the big boys from Wall Street? Well, you don't know what it is when the party of big business has its foot in the face of ordinary people. I do. I know poverty, and I know hardship in ways you and your brother have been spared, thank God. My father had been born in the Newark slums and become a chiropodist only by going to school at night while working by day on a bakery truck. And all his life, even after he had made a few bucks and we had moved into a house of our own, he continued to identify with the interests of what he called ordinary people and what I had taken to calling, along with Henry Wallace, the common man. I was terrifically disappointed to hear my father flatly refuse to vote for the candidate who, as I tried to convince him, supported his own New Deal principles. Wallace wanted a national health program, protection for unions, benefits for workers. He was opposed to Taft-Hartley and the persecution of labor. He was opposed to the Munt-Nixon bill and the persecution of political radicals. The Munt-Nixon bill, if passed, would require the registration with the government of all communist and Communist Front organizations. Wallace had said that Munt-Nixon was the first step to a police state, an effort to frighten the American people into silence. He called it the most subversive bill ever introduced in Congress. The Progressive Party supported the freedom of ideas to compete in what Wallace called the marketplace of thoughts. Most impressive to me was that, campaigning in the South, Wallace had refused to address any audience that was segregated, the first presidential candidate ever to have that degree of courage and integrity. The Democrats, I told my father, will never do anything to end segregation. They'll never outlaw lynching and the poll tax and Jim Crow. They never have and they never will. I don't agree with you, Nathan, he told me. You watch Harry Truman. Harry Truman has got a civil rights plank in his platform, and you watch and see what he does now that he's rid of those Southern bigots. Not only had Wallace bolted from the Democratic Party that year, but so had the bigots my father spoke of. The Southern Democrats who had formed their own party, the states' rights party, the Dixiecrats. They were running for president Governor Strom Thurmond of South Carolina, a rabid segregationist. The Dixiecrats were also going to draw away votes, Southern votes, that routinely went to the Democratic Party, which was another reason Dewey was favored to defeat Truman in a landslide. Every night over dinner in the kitchen, I did everything I could to persuade my father to vote for Henry Wallace and the restoration of the New Deal, and every night he tried to get me to understand the necessity for compromise in an election like this one. But as I had taken as my hero Thomas Paine, the most uncompromising patriot in American history, at the mere sound of the first syllable of the word compromise, I jumped up from my chair and told him and my mother and my 10-year-old brother, who, whenever I got going, liked to repeat to me in an exaggeratedly exasperated voice, "A vote for Wallace is a vote for Dewey," that I could never again eat at that table if my father was present. One night at dinner, my father tried another tack, to educate me further about the Republicans' contempt for every value of economic equality and political justice that I held dear, but I would have none of it. The two major political parties were equally without conscience when it came to the Negro's rights, equally indifferent to the injustices inherent in the capitalist system, equally blind to the catastrophic consequences for all of mankind of our country's deliberate provocation of the peace-loving Russian people. Close to tears, and meaning every word, I told my father, "I'm really surprised at you," as though it were he who was the uncompromising son. But a greater surprise was coming. Late on Saturday afternoon, he told me that he would rather I didn't go down to the mosque that evening to attend the Wallace rally. If I still wanted to, after we had spoken, he wouldn't try to stop me. But he at least wanted me to hear him out before I made my decision final. When I'd come home on Tuesday from the library and triumphantly announced at dinner that I had been invited to be a guest of Iron Rinn, the radio actor, at the Wallace rally downtown, I was obviously so thrilled at meeting Rinn, so beside myself with the personal interest he'd shown in me, that my mother had simply forbidden my father from raising his reservations about the rally. But now he wanted me to listen to what he felt he had a duty as a parent to discuss, and without my flying off the handle. My father was taking me as seriously as the Ringolds were, but not with Ira's political fearlessness, with Murray's literary ingenuity above all, with their seeming absence of concern for my decorum, for whether I would or would not be a good boy. The Ringolds were the 1-2 punch promising to initiate me into the big show, into my beginning to understand what it takes to be a man on the largest scale. The Ringolds compelled me to respond at a level of rigor that felt appropriate to who I now was. Be a good boy wasn't the issue with them. The sole issue was my convictions. But then, their responsibility wasn't a father's, which is to steer his son away from the pitfalls. The father has to worry about the pitfalls in a way the teacher doesn't. He has to worry about his son's conduct. He has to worry about socializing his little Tom Paine. But once little Tom Paine has been led into the company of men and the father is still educating him as a boy, the father is finished. Sure, he's worrying about the pitfalls. If he wasn't, it would be wrong, but he's finished anyway. Little Tom Paine has no choice but to write him off, to betray the father and go boldly forth to step straight into life's very first pit, and then, all on his own, providing real unity to his existence, to step from pit to pit for the rest of his days until the grave, which, if it has nothing else to recommend it, is at least the last pit into which one can fall. "Hear me out," my father said, "and then you make up your own mind. I respect your independence, son. You want to wear a Wallace button to school? Wear it. It's a free country. But you have to have all the facts. You can't make an informed decision without facts." Why had Mrs. Roosevelt, the great president's revered widow, withheld her endorsement and turned against Henry Wallace? Why had Harold Ickes, Roosevelt's trusted and loyal Secretary of Interior, a great man in his own right, withheld his endorsement and turned against Henry Wallace? Why had the CIO, as ambitious a labor organization as this country had ever known, withdrawn its money and its support from Henry Wallace? Because of the communist infiltration into the Wallace campaign. My father didn't want me to go to the rally because of the communist who had all but taken over the Progressive Party. He told me that Henry Wallace was either too naive to know it or, what was unfortunately probably closer to the truth, too dishonest to admit it. But communists, particularly from among communist-dominated unions already expelled from the CIO, "Red Baiter," I shouted, and I left the house. I took the 14 bus and went to the rally. I met Paul Robeson. He reached out to shake my hand after Ira introduced me as the kid at the high school he told him about. "Here he is, Paul. the boy who led the booing of Stephen A. Douglas. Paul Robeson, the Negro actor and singer, co-chairman of the Wallace for President Committee, who only a few months earlier at a Washington demonstration against the Mundt-Nixon bill had sung Old Man River to a crowd of 5,000 protesters at the foot of the Washington Monument, who'd been fearless before the Senate Judiciary Committee, telling them, when asked at their hearings on Mundt-Nixon if he would comply with the bill if it was passed, "I would violate the law." Then answering no less forthrightly, when asked what the Communist Party stood for complete equality of the Negro people. Paul Robeson took my hand in his and said, "Don't lose your courage, young man." Standing backstage with the performers and speakers at the mosque, enveloped simultaneously in two exotic new worlds, the leftist milieu and the world of the wings, was as thrilling as it would have been to sit down in the dugout with the players at a major league game. From the wings, I heard Ira do Abraham Lincoln again, this time tearing into not Stephen A. Douglas, but the warmongers in both political parties, supporting reactionary regimes all over the world, arming Western Europe against Russia, militarizing America. I saw Henry Wallace himself, stood no more than 20 feet away from him before he went onto the stage to address the crowd, and then stood almost at his side when Ira went up to whisper something to him at the gala reception after the rally. I stared at the presidential candidate, a Republican farmer's son from Iowa, as American-looking and American-sounding as any American I had ever seen, a politician against high prices, against big business, against segregation and discrimination, against appeasing dictators like Francisco Franco and Chiang Kai-shek, and I remember what Fast had written of Paine. His thoughts and ideas were closer to those of the average working man than Jefferson's could ever be. And in 1954, 6 years after that night at the mosque, when the candidate of the common man, the candidate of the people and the People's Party, raised gooseflesh all over me by clenching his fist and crying out from the lectern, "We are in the midst of a fierce attack upon our freedom," I got turned down for a Fulbright scholarship. I did not and could not have made a scrap of difference, and yet the zealotry to defeat communism reached even me. Ian Rinn had been born in Newark 2 decades before me, in 1913, a poor boy from a hard neighborhood and from a cruel family, who briefly attended Barringer High, where he failed every subject but gym. He had bad eyesight and useless glasses and could barely read what was in the lesson books, let alone what the teacher wrote on the blackboard. He couldn't see and he couldn't learn, and one day, as he explained it, "I just didn't wake up to go to school." Murray and Ira's father was someone Ira refused even to discuss. In the months after the Wallace rally, the most Ira ever told me was this: "My father, I couldn't talk to. He never paid the slightest bit of attention to his 2 sons. He didn't do this on purpose. It was the nature of the beast." Ira's mother, a beloved woman in his memory, died when he was 7, and her replacement he described as the stepmother you hear about in the fairy tales, a real bitch. He quit high school after a year and a half, and a few weeks later left the house forever at 15 and found a job digging ditches in Newark. Till the war broke out, while the country was in the Depression, he drifted round and round, first in New Jersey and then all over America, taking whatever work he could get, mostly jobs requiring a strong back. Immediately after Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Army. He couldn't see the eye chart, but a long line of guys was waiting for the examination, and so Ira went around up close to the chart, memorized as much of it as he could, then got back in line, and that was how he passed the physical. When Ira came out of the Army in 1945, he spent a year in Calumet City, Illinois, where he shared a room with the closest buddy he'd made in the service, a communist steelworker, Johnny O'Day. They'd been soldiers stevedores together on the docks in Iran, unloading Lend-Lease equipment that was shipped by rail through Tehran to the Soviet Union. Because of Ira's strength on the job, O'Day had nicknamed his friend Iron Man Ira. In the evenings, O'Day had taught the Iron Man how to read a book and how to write a letter, and gave him an education in Marxism. O'Day was a gray-haired guy some 10 years older than Ira. How he ever got into the service at his age, Ira said, I still don't know. A 6-foot as skinny as a telephone pole, but the toughest son of a bitch he'd ever met. O'Day carried in his gear a light punching bag that he used for his timing. So quick and strong was he that, if forced to, he could lick 2 or 3 guys together. And O'Day was brilliant. I knew nothing about politics. I knew nothing about political action, Ira said. I didn't know one political philosophy or one social philosophy from another, but this guy talked a lot to me, he said. He talked about the working man, about things in general in the United States, the harm our government was doing to the workers, and he backed up what he said with facts. And a nonconformist, O'Day was so nonconformist that everything he did not do by the book. Oh yeah, O'Day did a lot for me, I know that. Like Ira, O'Day was unmarried. Entangling alliances, he told Ira, is something I don't want any part of at no time. I regard kids as hostages to the malevolent. Though he had but a year's education more than Ira, on his own, O'Day had skilled himself, as he put it, in verbal and written polemics, by slavishly copying passage after passage out of all sorts of books, and with the aid of a grade school grammar, analyzing the structure of the sentences. It was O'Day who gave Ira the pocket dictionary that Ira claimed remade his life. I had a dictionary I read at night, Ira told me, the way you would read a novel. I had somebody send me a Roget's Thesaurus. After unloading ships all day, I would work every night to improve my vocabulary. He discovered reading. One day, it must have been one of the worst mistakes the Army ever made, they sent us a complete library. What an error, he said, laughing. I probably read every book they had in that library eventually. They built a Quonset hut to house the books, and they made shelves, and they told the guys, you want a book, you come in here and get one. It was O'Day who told him, who still told him, which books to get. Early on, Ira showed me 3 sheets of paper titled Some Concrete Suggestions for Ringgold's Utilization that O'Day had prepared when they were in Iran together. 1. Always keep a good dictionary at hand, a good one with plenty of antonyms and synonyms, even when you write a note to the milkman. And use it. Don't make wild passes at spelling and exact shades of meaning as you've been accustomed to doing. 2. Double space everything you write in order to permit interpolation of afterthoughts and corrections. I don't give a damn if it does violate good usage insofar as personal correspondence is involved. It makes for accurate expression. 3. Don't run your thoughts together in a solid page of typing. Every time you treat a new thought or elaborate what you're already talking about, indent for a new paragraph. It may add up to jerkiness, but it will be much more readable. 4. Avoid cliches. Even if you have to drag it in by the tail, express something you've read or heard quoted in other than the original words. One of your sentences from the other night at the library session in point of demonstration. I stated briefly some of the ills of the present regime. You've read that, Iron Man, and it isn't yours. It's somebody else's. It sounds as if it came out of a can. Suppose you express the same idea something like this. I build my argument about the effect of landed proprietorship and the dominance of foreign capital on what I have witnessed here in Iran. There were 20 points in all, and the reason Ira showed them to me was to assist with my writing. Not with my high school radio plays, but with my journal, intended to be political, where I was beginning to put down my own thoughts when I remembered to. I'd begun keeping my journal in imitation of Ira, who'd begun keeping his in imitation of Johnny O'Day. The 3 of us used the same brand of notebook, a dime pad from Woolworth's, 52 lined pages about 4 inches by 3 inches, stitched at the top and bound between mottle brown cardboard covers. When an O'Day letter mentioned a book, any book, Ira got a copy, and so did I. I'd go right to the library and take it out. I've been reading Bauer's Young Jefferson recently, O'Day wrote, along with other treatments of early American history. And the committees of correspondence in that period were the principal agency by which the revolutionary-minded colonists developed their understanding and coordinated their plans. That's how I came to read Young Jefferson while in high school. O'Day wrote, a couple of weeks ago, I bought the 12th edition of Bartlett's Quotations, allegedly for my reference library, actually for the enjoyment I get from browsing. And so I went downtown to the main library to sit among the reference books, browsing in Bartlett the way I imagined O'Day did, my journal beside me, skimming each page for the wisdom that would expedite my maturing and make me somebody to reckon with. I buy the Common Form, official organ published in Bucharest, regularly, O'Day wrote, but the Common Form, abbreviated name of the Communist Information Bureau, I knew I wouldn't find in any local library, and prudence cautioned me not to go looking. My radio plays were in dialogue and susceptible less to O'Day's concrete suggestions than to conversations Ira had with O'Day that he repeated to me, or rather acted out word for word, as though he and O'Day were together there before my eyes. The radio plays were colored, too, by the working man's argot that continued to crop up in Ira's speech long after he'd come to New York and become a radio actor, and their convictions were strongly influenced by those long letters O'Day was writing to Ira, which Ira often read aloud at my request. My subject was the lot of the common man, the ordinary Joe, the man that the radio writer Norman Corwin had lauded as the little guy in On a Note of Triumph, a 60-minute play that was transmitted over CBS radio the evening the war ended in Europe, and then again at popular request 8 days later, and that buoyantly entangled me in those salvationist literary aspirations that endeavored to redress the world's wrongs through writing. I wouldn't care to judge today if something I loved as much as I loved On a Note of Triumph was or was not art. It provided me with my first sense of the conjuring power of art and helped strengthen my first ideas as to what I wanted and expected a literary artist's language to do, enshrine the struggles of the embattled, and taught me, contrary to what my teachers insisted, that I could begin a sentence with "and." The form of the Corwin play was loose, plotless, experimental. I informed my chiropodist father and homemaking mother. It was written in the high, colloquial, alliterative style that may have derived in part from Clifford Odets and in part from Maxwell Anderson, from the effort by American playwrights of the 20s and 30s to forge a recognizable native idiom for the stage, naturalistic, yet with lyrical coloration and serious undertones, a poeticized vernacular that, in Norman Corwin's case, combined the rhythms of ordinary speech with a faint literary stiltedness to make for a tone that struck me, at 12, as democratic in spirit and heroic in scope, the verbal counterpart of a WPA mural. Whitman claimed America for the roughs. Norman Corwin claimed it for the little man, who turned out to be nothing less than the Americans who had fought the Patriotic War and were coming back to an adoring nation. The little man was nothing less than Americans themselves. Corwin's little guy was American for proletariat. And, as I now understand it, the revolution fought and won by America's working class was, in fact, World War II. The something large that we were all, however small, a part of, the revolution that confirmed the reality of the myth of a national character to be partaken of by all, including me. I was a Jewish child, no two ways about that, but I didn't care to partake of the Jewish character. I didn't even know clearly what it was. I didn't much want to. I wanted to partake of the national character. Nothing had seemed to come more naturally to my American-born parents. Nothing came more naturally to me, and no method could have seemed to me any more profound than participating through the tongue that Norman Corwin spoke, a linguistic distillation of the excited feelings of community that the war had aroused, the high, demotic poetry that was the liturgy of World War II. History had been scaled down and personalized. America had been scaled down and personalized. For me, that was the enchantment not only of Norman Corwin, but of the times. You flood into history, and history floods into you. You flood into America, and America floods into you. And all by virtue of being alive in New Jersey, and 12 years old, and sitting by the radio in 1945. Back when popular culture was sufficiently connected to the last century to be susceptible still to a little language, there was a swooning side to all of it for me. It can at last be said without jinxing the campaign. Somehow the decadent democracies, the bungling Bolsheviks, the saps and softies, were tougher in the end than the brown-shirt bully boys, and smarter too. For without whipping a priest, burning a book, or slugging a Jew, without corralling a girl in a brothel or bleeding a child for plasma, far-flung ordinary men, unspectacular but free, rousing out of their habits and their homes, got up early one morning, flexed their muscles, learned, as amateurs, the manual of arms, and set out across perilous plains and oceans to whop the bejesus out of the professionals. This they did. For confirmation, see the last communiqué, bearing the mark of the Allied High Command. Clip it out of the morning paper and hand it over to your children for safekeeping. When On a Note of Triumph appeared in book form, I bought a copy immediately, making it the first hardcover I'd ever owned outright rather than borrowed on my library card. And over several weeks, I memorized the 65 pages of free verse-like paragraphs in which the text was arranged, relishing particularly the lines that took playful liberties with everyday street corner English. "There's a hot time in the old town of Dniepropetrovsky tonight." Or that joined unlikely proper nouns so as to produce what seemed to me to be surprising and stirring ironies. The mighty warrior lays down his samurai sword before a grocery clerk from Baltimore. At the conclusion of a great war effort that had provided a splendid stimulus for fundamental feelings of patriotism to grow strong in someone my age, almost 9 when the war began and halfway to 13 when it came to a close, the mere sighting on the radio of American cities and states through the nippy night air of New Hampshire, from Egypt to the Oklahoma prairie town, and the reasons for mourning in Denmark are the same as they are in Ohio, had every ounce of the intended apotheosizing effect. So they've given up. They're finally done in, and the rat is dead in an alley back of the Wilhelmstrasse. Take a bow, GI. Take a bow, little guy. The Superman of tomorrow lies at the feet of you common men of this afternoon. This was the panegyric with which the play opened. On the radio, there'd been an unflinching voice, not unlike Iron Rind's, assertively identifying our hero for the praise due him. It was the determined, compassionately gruff, slightly hectoring halftime voice of the high school coach, the coach who also teaches English, the voice of the common man's collective conscience. And this was Corwin's coda, a prayer whose grounding in the present made it seem to me, already an affirmed atheist, wholly secular and unchurchy, while at the same time mightier and more daring than any prayer I had ever heard recited in school at the beginning of the day, or had read, translated in the prayer book at the synagogue when I was alongside my father at high holiday services. Lord God of trajectory and blast, Lord God of fresh bread and tranquil mornings, Lord God of the topcoat and the living wage, measure out new liberties, post proofs that brotherhood, sit at the treaty table and convoy the hopes of little peoples through expected straits. Tens of millions of American families had sat beside their radios and, complex as this stuff was compared to what they were used to hearing, listened to what had aroused in me, and I innocently assumed in them, a stream of transforming, self-abandoning emotions such as I, for one, had never before experienced as a consequence of anything coming out of a radio. The power of that broadcast. There, amazingly, was soul coming out of a radio. The spirit of the common man had inspired an immense mélange of populist adoration, and a fusion of words bubbling straight up from the American heart into the American mouth, an hour-long homage to the paradoxical superiority of what Corwin insisted on identifying as absolutely ordinary American mankind, far-flung ordinary men, unspectacular but free. Corwin modernized Tom Paine for me by democratizing the risk, making it a question not of just one wild man, but a collective of all the little just men pulling together. Worthiness and the people were one. Greatness and the people were one. A thrilling idea. And how Corwin labored to force it, at least imaginatively, to come true. After the war, for the first time, Ira consciously entered the class struggle. He'd been up to his neck in it his entire life, he told me, without any idea what was going on. Out in Chicago, he worked for $45 a week in a record factory that the United Electrical Workers had organized under a contract so solid they even had union hiring. O'Day, meanwhile, returned to his job on a rigging gang at Inland Steel in Indiana Harbor. Time and again, O'Day dreamed about quitting, and at night in their room would pour his frustration out to Ira. If I could have full time for 6 months and no handcuffs, the party could really be built here in the harbor. There's plenty of good people, but what's needed is a guy who can spend all his time at organizing. I ain't that good at organizing, that's true. You have to be something of a handholder with timid Bolsheviks, and I lean more to bopping their heads. And what's the difference anyway? The party here's too broke to support a full-timer. Every dime that can be scraped up is going for defense of our leadership and for the press and a dozen other things that won't wait. I was broke after my last check, but I got by on Jawbone for a while. But taxes, the damn car, one thing and another. Iron Man. I can't handle it. I have to go to work. I loved when Ira repeated the lingo that rough union guys used among themselves, even guys like Johnny O'Day, whose sentence structure wasn't quite so simple as the average working man's, but who knew the power of their diction and who, despite the potentially corrupting influence of the thesaurus, wielded it effectively all his life. I have to take it on the slow bell for a while. All this with the management poising the X. As soon as we pulled the pin, as soon as the boys hit the bricks, if they move to force the acceptance of their Yellow Dog contract, it looks like blood on the bricks. I loved when Ira explained the workings of his own union, the UE, and described the people at the record factory where he'd worked. It was a solid union, progressively led, controlled by the rank and file. Rank and file. 3 little words that thrilled me, as did the idea of hard work, tenacious courage, and a just cause to fuse the two. Of the 150 members on each shift, 100 or so attended the bi-weekly shop meetings. Although most of the work is hourly paid, Ira told me, there's no whip swinging at the factory. You understand? If a boss has something to tell you, he's courteous about it. Even for serious offenses, the offender's called into the office together with the steward. Makes a big difference. Ira would tell me all that transpired at an ordinary union meeting. Routine business like proposals for a new contract, the problem of absenteeism, a parking lot beef, discussion of the looming war. He meant war between the Soviet Union and the United States, racism, the wages, causes, prices myth, going on, not just because I was, at 15 and 16, eager to learn all that a working man did, how he talked and acted and thought, but because even after he cleared out of Calumet City to go to New York to work in radio and was solidly established as Iron Rin on The Free and the Brave, Ira continued to speak of the record plant and the union meetings in the charismatic tongue of his fellow workers, talked as though he still went off to work there every morning. Every night, rather, for after a short while he had got himself put on the night shift so that he could have his days for missionary work, by which I eventually learned he meant proselytizing for the Communist Party. O'Day had recruited Ira into the party when they were on the docks in Iran, just as I, anything but orphaned, was the perfect target for Ira's tutorials. The orphaned Ira was the perfect target for O'Day's.